Hey, it's Rod Yates. Welcome to another episode of Humans of Music, a Jaxsta podcast. Each episode I talk to a music creator or industry professional about their life and career, the ups and downs of their journey and the lessons they've learned. And I'm very happy today to be joined by Midnight Oil vocalist Peter Garrett and multi-instrumentalist Jim Moginie. Midnight Oil recently released their 13th studio album, Resist. It's the follow-up to 2020 mini-album The Macarada Project and features the final contributions of bass player Bones Hillman, who sadly passed away in 2020. Resist is the Oil's first full-length since 2002's Capricornia, after which they disbanded and singer Peter Garrett pursued his career in politics. They reunited for 2017's Great Circle Comeback Tour, which saw the band play 77 shows around the globe. Sadly though, Midnight Oil gigs are soon going to be a thing of the past, with the group announcing that the tour in support of Resist will be their last. For an act that came up through the late 70s and early 80s Australian pub rock scene, playing hundreds of gigs a year, it'll be a sad day when they play their final show together. Before that though, there is new music to listen to and to talk about, so without further ado, here's Peter Garrett with Jim Moginie to follow in the second half of the show. The sessions for the album happened towards the end of 2019, and the first fruits that we heard from those sessions were the Macarada Project, which came out 2020, and those songs were linked by themes of reconciliation and the Youll Statement from the Heart. If you were looking for themes that would link Resist, is it the environment? Is it environmental concerns?
I think environmental concerns and the climate crisis and an awareness that we're treating the planet like, a toilet, and it's way overdue, the day of reckoning for us to change the way that we live and interact with the natural world has always been a big part of what Midnight Oil has written and sung about and acted on, and it's a big part of my life, years ago and so on. So yes, it's a record about that, but it's a call to action in some ways from us, because a lot of what we have been saying, we've said before, and we're not trying to put ourselves up as the sort of serious change makers of planet world or planet Australia, but at the same time, I think, on reflection, there's a deeper sense of anger and frustration and a lack of realisation that some of the things that have been important to us, whether it's our leaders, whether it's the political or economic system, just hasn't been able to respond to or deal with satisfactorily. And it's really going to be people that make the change, people who, by their own actions, can do it, not taking responsibility for these day-to-day issues of, say, for example, your personal carbon emissions. We'll all try and do our bit, everybody should, but people to make those who have the power to make the change responsible, those who are basically consigning us to a hothouse earth, an unlivable planet, who are so greedy and stupid and short-sighted and mendacious that they don't realise what they're actually doing for their kids and their grandkids. It's up to us to resist them, and by us we mean everybody. Now we're serious and we're on a soapbox and we can be too preachy, and sometimes you just want to say yeah whatever, go away. But we can't be any different to that. This is our DNA. Resist is our DNA,
and that propels the song We Resist. Is that what you're trying to sum up in that song?
Well, look, it's Jimmy brought it in, and it's such a wonderfully poignant recitation of this spirit that we need to have as humans, and also an understanding that in history it's only by that human spirit stepping up and being brave and holding power to account that the great historical changes happened, that women did get the vote, that kids came out of coal mines and weren't treated like canaries any longer, that we stopped thinking it was okay to have laws that prejudiced people simply because the colour of their skin was different. I mean, these are basic fundamental human rights. So the way that he's crafted the song was so poignantly powerful that it's got a central place on the record, and the record got named after it.
The first song on the record, Rising Seas, I just wanted to quote the opening lines. Every child put down your toys and come inside to sleep. We have to look you in the eye and say we sold you cheap. Let's confess we did not act with serious urgency, so open up the floodgates to the rising seas. There's a great sadness to that line, and almost an admission of defeat, which is going against what you've been saying there in terms of the spirit and that idea of resisting. Is there, though, an element of you that feels like that, an element of defeat?
Well, I'm an optimist by nature, and I think hope is what you say and do, to quote us again, from Red Sails in the Sunset. We've always had that spirit of defiance. We've always thought that, we can sort of give our finger to the forces of darkness and get on top of things. And there are plenty of examples of that happening, and they're listed in Resist, amongst other things. Yet, at the same time, on climate in particular and the climate crisis, we can't stop the heat that's already in the system. The best that we can do is to stabilise. And if there is an ice sheet that's melting, it may be used by Volvo in a car ad, but the truth of it is that it's actually going to push people away from where they live in Pacific Islands and in low-lying areas in cities, and that is no small thing. So, yeah, there is an element of not so much resignation, but a recognition that we've allowed things to go too far, but that still doesn't mean that we can't turn it around, and it doesn't mean that we won't and shouldn't do everything within our power to turn things around. But let's not kid ourselves, It's not like we've got a lot of time, and if you're prepared to open your eyes and see what's actually happening in the world, then maybe when you get out of bed in the morning, you'll do something about it.
And putting that song first on the album, does that set the platform for some of the anger and some of the desperation that follows in a number of songs?
Yeah, it probably does. But I think, we bring the songs into a room. People will have songs and there's been some really wonderful pieces of music here. And look, if you think about, well, particularly Rob and Jim, and sort of writing really strong foundational music for us to then build this Midnight Oil thing upon, it's inevitable as people who feel and who care that you're going to see this. And then you add it to our mix of, Bolshevik activism and what have you, and then you try and take that to the next step, and you realise that even having done that, you're still, in some ways, saying what you were saying 25, 30 or 40 years ago. So, of course, you've got to pause and say, well, maybe we failed. What could we have done more about it? And it's our responsibility as well. We're talking about it constantly and raving on, but it's not our responsibility and to say we've failed as a people. The failure is in the systems and the people that we elect to govern us and the people that we basically confer economic power and rights to. So we're talking about systems change that's long overdue, but of course systems can only change if people are prepared to change as well.
Absolutely. I remember speaking with Billy Bragg, and he was saying that a big revelation for him in his career was the moment that he realised that no matter how hard he tries, he can't change the world. He's one person. He can't change the world. And you've just been talking there about the systems need to change. But was there a point in your career where you believed that you could change the world and that you also had to come to that revelation that, well, that may not be the case, but you can talk about issues?
Well, it's a multidimensional thing that we're discussing because in some instances, individuals can change the world and they do. And you have to have that inherent belief and faith, whether it's working on something in your street or in your office or, on a canvas, wherever it might be. And I certainly have always had that strong belief, and I'll continue to have it. And I can list off a whole bunch of different things that Midnight Oil's been involved with, or I've been involved with personally, or the ACF campaigns. The Antarctica, taking the Japanese to the International Court of Justice, the World Heritage Areas in the Daintree, Jervis Bay. We've been involved in lots of things, and we've had some wins along the way. But in the bigger picture, in terms of what we're doing to the planet, in terms of the equity of opportunity for citizens worldwide, in terms of the fact that we still treat nature as a free good and that we've got we're overheating the system, we failed. And we need to accept responsibility for that. And baby boomers as a generation need to wake up to the fact that the baby boomer generation has been very privileged, and we're part of that. And so I think we're feeling a sense of not so much disappointment, but just an awareness that that's where we are now. And of course we want to do something about it. We will always want to do something about it. We've got a record and we'll do some stuff when we're touring as well, but it's we're 11th hour. This is an 11th hour album.
Back before when we spoke before your reunion, just as Midnight Oil had announced their reunion, and you were saying that to come back together, you had to ask yourself some questions, and they were: what do we have to say? What have we got to do musically, and has it got a hard centre and some content and a bit of heart to it? When did you realise that you would have songs that would fulfil that criteria?
I've forgotten I summarised it so well. Can we use that again? Well, I think when we gathered up at Jim's, got a little studio up in Brookvale. It's now been called the Clubhouse, apparently, and that's pretty much what it is. It's where you go in the morning and take yourself down and turn on the amps and listen to the sort of the feedback and have a cup of tea and go, okay, here we go, strap yourself in for the ride. And people started throwing songs on the table. And we clearly had, as we've always had, because there's a lot of writers in the band, so you've got a lot of material. And from that, okay, which songs are we? And as you said in your introduction, Rod, you're absolutely right. You know, some of them just really lent themselves to working with First Nations people, and they became Makarrata. And then the remainder, we thought, well, let's just see if what we've got and how it goes when we record them. And they went down. I mean, it's always a good sign for any record, but particularly for Midnight Oil, because we can overthink, is if we just do it instinctively and just rush at it. And it went down pretty quickly. Most of these songs went down fairly quickly. Good sign. We knew some had got rewrites and some had additions to them. Some came in full shape. I mean, very much like we've always been. You know, it's a mixture of all of the above, but very strong underlying ideas and musicality and themes. And actually for me, and I think for everybody else, it was probably one of the most exhilarating recording sessions for somebody who's pretty much lived in a studio for 30 years, one way or the other. And I'm not an over-rehearser, as everybody knows. But to find yourself in there with just the sound that we'd already created and just letting rip onto it and saying, okay, that's done, you know.
Yeah.
Let's put it out. The hardest thing has been waiting to put it out.
Right. That's the pandemic that's got in the way of that?
Yeah, like it's got in the way of a whole lot of things for a whole lot of people. So this is probably not big beer, but in small beer world, we did want to get the record out.
Right. The success of the Great Circle reunion tour, the global tour, did that put a fire under in your bellies when you got back into the studio? Did it fuel what you were writing when you got in the studio?
I'm not sure about that. I think we were blown away by the audience responses and the numbers of people that came, particularly overseas in South America and the States and Europe and so on. And we actually went back and did some more over there. So, I mean, if you think about it, we're pretty contrary, and who would have gone away for 14 years, you know, and who would have gone into government and done all of these other things and then come back and thought, yeah, the rock and roll stage is actually my natural playpen.
Right.
And as it turned out, of course, it is.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I think Great Circle was an incredible experience for us and a whirlwind. But then it was a really open question. And each stage has been an open question for us.
Sure.
Where we have to examine it against what you said earlier. Is it any good? Are we just repeating ourselves? Can we make sense of the world around us and come up with things that hopefully lift people up or entertain or you know, shake them around a bit?
Yeah.
And can that happen to me, particularly when I go in to sort of take the songs and as they become Midnight Oil songs? And we were able to do that, and we're very thankful for that.
Sure.
It's an incredible privilege to still be able to make music at this stage of life, you know.
That collective radar that you must have for is it any good? Have you always had that? Have you ever lost that?
I think we might have lost it occasionally along the way. I don't think you could ever claim to perfection on that count at all. I think we're at our best when we're stripping down what it is we have to say and how we want to play to its essential sort of constituent parts, and then we don't overthink it and just go for it. You know, obviously there's a lot of musicianship in the band. There's a lot of arranging and composing skills that people have. And that's a great thing. It gives us the character of Midnight Oil, which is a little bit hard to pin down musically. I mean, Oil songs quite often sound pretty straightforward and simple until you try and play them. And then it's like, what are they doing? How does that work? I don't know half the time myself, you know.
Right.
But at the same time, coming through this time, I think in some ways, you know, especially for me, having time out of music means that my love of music and my ability, if you like, not to just think of it as something that's like ho-hum, but that's something like the rarest, most precious jewel on earth is still there.
These songs are, of course, Bones' last contributions to the band before he sadly passed away last year. Yes, 2020. Beg your pardon. What does it mean to you to have his performances on this record and the Makarrata project?
Well, I think that they're both a great testament to his musicianship and, you know, his gifts as a member of the band. And even though he was the new member, you know, he'd been with us for like 27, 28 years. So that just, you know, losing Bonesy was like losing a limb or a family member. And we all felt it deeply. We all felt it, and we still do feel it to this day. We love Adam Ventura and what he's brought to the band, and his playing is incredibly strong. And he's not trying to replicate what Bones did at all. He brings his own musicianship. But Bonesy's all over these records, actually, and you hear his voice so clearly. Probably the best singer in the band, actually, if the truth be known. and his playing was you know, very thoughtful and, you know, completely sympathetic to whatever he had in front of him. So it's sad, you know, to lose a mate. And he was the youngest Oil, you know, as well. Yet we're grateful that he was able to play on both of these records and do such an incredible job.
Does his absence contribute to your decision to make this the final tour?
Oh, look, it's a really good question, and others have speculated about that. And I don't really know. I think it probably has had a bit to do with it. But I suspect that we would have made the decision anyway, even had he survived, because his passing away is evidence enough for us about the fact that the mortal coil is alight and burning, and you'd be a narcissist or a fool to ignore that fact, and you can't pretend otherwise. And whether it's sports people that, you know, get out for that last season because they love the roar of the crowd and the game, or whether it's performers that drag themselves out onto the stage. And you know, you'll have to drag me off a stage somewhere, but for the Oils, definitely, this is the right time for us to say this is who we are and this is what we've done, and we'll go off and do other things. Whether it's together or separately remains to be seen.
Sure. Road work was always so important to the band, particularly in those early days. You would play hundreds and hundreds of shows when you were starting out. The modus operandi seemed to be that was your way that you would break through. The industry, if I understand correctly, wasn't particularly welcoming in the early days. Is that the case?
No, you've summed it up exactly right. And I mean, in the early days, people said, "Oh, well, you know, get rid of the singer because he can't sing. He's just running around and jumping up and down and, you know, talking about politics all the time, you know, through a microphone." No one really understood. No one really wanted to know. And I think that hardened our resolve as much as anything. And it also made us realise that the only way such a strange beast as Midnight Oil could exist was literally to sort of make our own rules and do it our own way. And eventually, over time, you know, we found fans and friends within the industry, people who came to share the vision, if you like. And because we were always supported by a loyal fan base and we'd never really walked away from them, we were always able to essentially stay alive by playing alive. And that playing live has always been a big part of what the band's done. And the muscle memory that you get from those early days, whether it's the Beatles in Hamburg or, you know, Cold Chisel at the Coleman Cutter or Sly and the Family Stone in some, you know, club in Chicago, that stuff is irreplaceable. It stays with you forever.
Sure. There's an incredible self-belief, though, that idea that you were told that you weren't a great singer. The band were told that they wouldn't be signed because of you initially. But there's a self-belief on your behalf to go, well, stuff them. I'm going to keep doing this. And for the band as well to go, yeah, stuff them. We believe in this. Who instilled that self-belief in you?
Oh, great question. So, well, probably partly it comes from your upbringing, from your parents, in my case, particularly from my mum that I was close to. And, I mean, she wasn't pumping me up like parents pump their kids up nowadays and saying, you know, well, you're definitely a genius or you're definitely, you know, a fantastic this or a fantastic that. It was more a case of, look, if you want to do something and you're prepared to work at it hard enough, then great, go and do it, and you'll succeed in as much as you'll survive. But I think the other answer to that question, part of the answer to that question, is that the conventional metrics of success have never honestly meant anything to the band. They just don't. It's not like we're knocking the metrics, and once you've got levels of success, of course you appreciate it, but it's not really centre of our way of thinking about things. Some people probably think about it more than others in the band. Some actually probably never think about it at all. It's always more been about, okay, the world maybe doesn't understand or want to support us in this particular reason or that particular reason, but does that really matter? If we can go and find an audience in some scabby pub or down on the beach, and then we'll just go and play to them and we'll survive.
Yeah.
They're there, we're here.
Yeah.
What's the problem?
I love the phrase that you'll survive, because some of those gigs in that pub rock scene at that time.
Let's face it, we were lucky to survive some of it, and so were the audiences. And they were very intense times, but you're young and you throw everything you have at it, and you're connecting with people where it counts, which is essentially in their heart, in their mind, in their eyes, in their living room, in their backyard. It's not being mediated by somebody else. And for the Oars, I think that's the most important thing at all. As long as we can make a direct connection with people, you don't have to agree with what we're saying. In fact, a lot of the audience sometimes doesn't, and they may come back to it 10 years' time and say, maybe, maybe not. But at least you're connecting with them directly. No one else is using that opportunity to, flog you a timeshare resort or, send you prompts about whether you want to buy a certain, product or pumping you up so that they can make more money out of your effort.
Sure. Last thing about those early days in the Australian pub circuit, I remember speaking to Jimmy Barnes, and he told me this story that a Midnight Oil gig was so crowded in one of the beer barns that you were playing that he actually threw beer bottles at the window to try and smash them to get fresh air to come in. For someone who wasn't there, how would you sum up the mood of an Australian rock show in a pub in those days?
Look, I would sum it up as a cross between a wild dance party, a crazy game of footy, all ages, and after a while, all sexes, confined within the smallest imaginable area so that you were sharing lots of bodily fluids with the person next to you at a volume level just bearable and in temperatures slightly above what you get in the Western Desert. And then add the emotional release of actually sharing that experience both on and off stage, and no one around to tell you that you couldn't do that. So at one point it did become so physical and visceral that you wondered whether you were surviving. They're not apocryphal, the stories of us carrying oxygen tanks around with us, which we had backstage. We actually did have them. And, Rob and I used to have to go and suck on them. And occasionally people did break the windows because everything had steamed up and it was so hot. But it was a palpable thing which you weren't trying to create. It just happened. It was organic. It was combustible and it was totally wild. And we were really, when you look back on it, pretty lucky that everybody sort of got out in one piece. But it was unforgettable.
How did it set you up when you went onto the world stage?
Well, after you've done that in pubs, particularly in Sydney, Melbourne and Brisbane in summer, then apart from cold temperatures, there's no gig that you're going to go to that's going to really trouble you too much. And, I think the point about it is that we could confidently walk onto a stage pretty much just about anywhere and feel like, we can play this one out because we've done it 180 times, and sometimes with people throwing things at us and other times with the air conditioning falling down, the police coming to close the joint down and someone running off with our money and heading off, down the street, in a sports car and us running after them.
You're unbreakable at that point.
Well, you're breaking inside, but you don't show anyone.
Your live show has taken you to some incredible places. And of course, the Western Desert region, which you mentioned earlier, is one of those places for the Black Fella, White Fella tour. How did that experience change you?
Look, it's been pretty well documented, Rod, and I think the short answer is that it changed us in ways we never could have imagined. It made us into more thoughtful people. We had more empathy and understanding for First Nations people and Indigenous culture, and it changed the way in which we created music as well, because Diesel's a different kind of record than 10 to 1 or Postcard had been. And it produced a series of relationships and friendships and connections, which, have had some roundabouts and ups and downs, but which have been very profound to the man and have meant a great deal to us and still do. And I think that found its fruit in Makarrata. So in some ways, Diesel and Makarrata are the bookends of our connections and interactions with First Nations people. And we believe the Uluru Statement of the Heart needs to happen. And we just cannot believe that we're one of the few countries in the world that doesn't mention its original people in its constitution. That must be remedied and will be remedied, and hopefully soon.
You're optimistic that it will be soon?
If there's a change of government, it could happen soon. If not, it will still happen, I'm sure, but it unfortunately just might take longer.
Okay. Last couple of things, Peter. Almost 50 years ago, you responded to an ad in the Sydney Morning Herald for a band looking for a singer. That band was Farm and featured Jim Moginie and Rob Hurst, of course, your bandmates in Midnight Oil. This many decades on, you're still together with Jim and Rob. How would you describe your relationship?
I think mutual respect and shared visions, despite the very big differences sometimes in personality and even views about what should and shouldn't happen to the band. All very different people, and I include Martin in that as well, really. But somehow we land on this place where we agree that this is what Midnight Oil should stand for, or what Midnight Oil should record, or what Midnight Oil should be. And there's always an internal tension in a band between individual aspirations and contributions and gifts and the collective whole. And that tension's the essential energy that fuels us. And, you know, we can be a little middle class and sort of polite and not necessarily sort of throw things at one another and just try and work it through in other ways or let things work themselves through. But at the end of the day, I look back on both the performances, the body of work, and the things that flowed out of that. And those relationships, you realise, have been incredible. They've endured and they're to be valued greatly.
Absolutely. Last thing, at some point in the near future, Midnight Oil will play their final show. Mentally, are you prepared for what it will feel like to walk off stage on that final gig?
No, not really. I think probably if I think about it too much, you know, I'll go all wobbly. So it's best that I just wait until the moment and jump on and just let the energy of what's going on and the emotion of what's going on carry me through.
Fair enough. Peter, thanks so much for your time, mate. It's always great to chat with you. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Hey, Rob, not at all. Same from here, mate. Really lovely.
We have to take a quick break, but when we come back, I speak with Midnight Oil co-founder and multi-instrumentalist Jim Moginie. Welcome back to Humans of Music. In this part of the show, I'm joined by Midnight Oil co-founder, multi-instrumentalist, and one of the band's primary songwriters, Jim Moginie. Jim owns Oceanic Studios in Manly, which is where Midnight Oil started working on the songs that would become the Makarrata project and Resist. When I asked him how it felt to be writing new Midnight Oil music for the first time in almost 2 decades, he said it was like getting back on the horse, albeit with a slight difference.
It was like an older horse, a wiser horse, maybe goes a bit slower, but it sort of knows a lot more than it did when it was 20. And we realised that it all came together, that a lot of the songs were of a particular subject matter. So we parked all the Makarrata project songs on one side about First Nations issues, and then ended up realising that the rest of it was a bit of a grab bag of protest music, really, and everything was, which Resist is sort of a protest record in the old tradition of protest music, of a song about global warming, the rising seas, and sort of a hypothetical glimpse into the future where, I guess no one's listening and the water levels have come up and the streets are empty and the captains of industry have moved to higher ground and the poor people are down on the low ground and they get drowned, and like the Tuvalu Islands in the Pacific and things are happening as we speak. So there was that song, and then at the time of writing, which is more of a thing about don't wait until it's too late to act. If you can do something now, do it. And of course our politicians are really good at not doing it.
Right.
And prevaricating and procrastinating, and while Rome's burning, it does feel like that, literally.
You do feel that in the record. There is a palpable sense of anger, particularly in songs like Reef, for example. It's got that line, "We've got the green light, we're going to dynamite a World Heritage Site." And in the Barker-Darling River, another line, "What you see is an act of terror." Was anger the prevailing spirit that was driving you when you were writing these songs?
Yeah, it always has, though. Like it's always been there. It's been no exception. Reef is sort of like a tongue-in-cheek thing in a way, a yes ministry type of observation of how yes ministry things get. Oh, we had to destroy it in order to save it, that kind of thing.
Right.
And the whole business with Morrison holding up the coal in the Parliament, just unbelievable stuff. For any child growing up in the planet to see that, it's just like, well, I hate politicians, I hate politics. I will never go into politics, so I can never change anything, which is why there's a lot of depression in young people. They just feel powerless against the giant, Goliaths that walk the earth. And also the Darling River as well. I mean, the bungling and the selling the water rights for hundreds of millions of dollars and big cotton, and the way they just suck the water out of the river and then more and more and more as much as they can. if they can get away with it. I mean, things have changed a bit now, but it's still Indigenous people and everyone downstream, all the fish, well, everyone will perish because of that decision-making by the government. It's an arid land, and water is such a precious commodity. It can't be squandered and sold off to whatever. It has to be cared for. The earth has to be cared for. That sounds very hippie-ish, doesn't it? But it's true. It's like, we are hippies, hippies with guitars, but also just people who just got kids, and we're just concerned about stuff, and we like having a conversation with people about this stuff. It's nothing more or nothing less. It's like, have you thought about these things?
Right. The Barker-Darling River it's an epic, almost 7 minutes long, but it's almost a bit of a throwback to some of the the prog influences that were propelling you early on in the band's career in that regard. And I believe it was a co-write between you and Rob, and you've both had a songwriting partnership which stretches back to the 70s. How intuitive is your songwriting partnership with Rob?
Well, that song actually was a bit of a tip of the hat to Evie, parts 1, 2, and 3, actually. It's for me. It was sort of like, let's put something together, 3 things that are sort of unfinished and that are really different from each other. But yeah, it is intuitive. Well, I could say Evie and we'd know exactly what we were talking about. With some other people, they wouldn't know.
Right. I
think it's really intuitive. There's almost a sense of, I guess talking about it's dangerous because I don't want to sort of, let the genie out of the bottle or kind of destroy the magic of whatever it is that happens. But he's very strong with his lyrics, but I'll have some sort of musical idea of what to put with it almost immediately, I suppose. Or I'll just randomly look in at one of my songbooks that I've got lying around and go, oh, there's a chord sequence. That could work. It's quite art school in a way, the way it's created sometimes, very kind of random, but sometimes that makes it better. And his great melodic sense and lyrical sense as well. And I think we do have an intuitive thing. And also with Pete, because Pete comes in, and you can't overlook Pete in all of this because he's such a great force. And he's a wonderful lyricist as well. He's sort of painting pictures of the Australian landscape and the surf culture. He's written some incredible lines and as well. So he'll usually come in with me when I've got a song that's not really finished or lyrically a little incomplete, and he'll just come in and either try and do a complete rewrite, which he's done, or just augment the words that are there. And I'm usually, well, if it works for you, you're the singer, let's do it. Like, I'm very not precious about that sort of stuff, really. So the relationship with all 3 of us and Martin throwing in his sort of 2 box worth at the end, if it doesn't get past Martin, it doesn't get past anybody.
Okay.
He'll say, yeah, that's a good one, but he won't talk about the other one. And I'll leave that for later. But this one's good. Let's do this. So he's a really important factor in the song creation as well. So it's a real team. It's like it isn't so much me and Rob. Perhaps myself and Rob generate some of the things initially, but it isn't always the midnight oil that you hear. It has to go through the fire, through the process, or through the caucus, or whatever you want to call it, to get to the other end. But it's sort of a good combination of people, yeah.
Yeah. The song We Resist, as you mentioned, is very much a protest song. Who instilled that spirit in you, that idea to stand up for what you believe in?
Well, I mean, it's what instilled that? Well, I suppose initially with us, it's when we started, we'd play benefit shows a lot. So we do things like Greenpeace benefits or the Wilderness Society, or perhaps we do Save the Whales or, Nuclear Disarmament Party or whatever it was. And a lot of those people we got to know in the early days, that we weren't really welcomed by the industry because our music was too angular and, as you said, a bit proggy. And they didn't like Pete's voice, and there was all these problems with we were on an independent label, which we actually founded, called Powderworks Records, which was distributed by a major company, but it was very hard to find our records in the shops then. So we align ourselves with these people that really wanted us to help with a cause, and by actually getting to know some of those people, whether it was Bob Brown or some of the big plays in those organisations, Greenpeace and things, we'd sort of get to know them as people, and we get to totally understand where they were coming from. And I think they were always people who were incredibly brave, putting their bodies on the line, lying down in front of bulldozers. It's still happening down on the Tarkine with the tailings mine that's being proposed and all the clear felling of logging and this. It should be a World Heritage area, but no, this particular area is still going to be stuffed around with. And anyway, we realised that those people were incredibly brave. So we totally took our hats off to them. It was one of those. And then I think also realising that this wasn't such a thing that was such an anomaly in music. It's like in music, there's always been a great tradition of protest music, where you go right back to the Pete Seegers of the world, or Woody Guthrie, "This Land Is Our Land." It's for everybody. And Sam Cooke's, "Change Is Going to Come." One of the best protest songs ever been written. It doesn't sound like one. It sounds like a beautiful soul tune. Whether it's, bands like The Alarm or The Clash, punk bands that going on, talking about Spanish bombs and talking about Sandinistas and things, or whether it was more, the hip-hop side of things, people like Briggs and Trials in Australia and AB Original and people like that. And then you've got people now like Jack River who are doing really good things. And you've got the hip-hop side of things, which seems to be more where the activism's gone, more than rock and roll, which has sort of become pretty sanitized for me these days. It feels a bit corporate and a bit sort of lovey-dovey or something. So there's been this grand tradition, Gil Scott-Heron. I mean, the list goes on and on. Marvin Gaye's What's Going On. There's a huge list of these people that have made these important records, which were really popular. It isn't necessarily consigning you to the throw-out bin by being au courant or talking about what's going on in the world. It's actually needed now, in more than it ever has been. And I think we've always written to that. I think we've always had that in our mind. It's never been, well, for a start, we probably couldn't write a love song to save our lives anyway.
Right.
Not that there's anything wrong with love songs, but I'm a sucker for them as much as anyone. But you know what I'm saying? It's like we're part of a grand tradition, I feel.
Sure.
Standing on the shoulders of these people and what's gone before us, and also singing about where we're from, not some sort of general down with the corporate man and, down with, the bureaucracy and down with government and down with this and that. We are a bit like that sometimes, but it's tempered by this sort of whole thing of having a discussion with people and trying to just put things in front of them, and they kind of go, yeah, I agree with that, or no, I don't agree with that. But that's fine.
Yeah.
It's just, I guess we've been good at riding the wave of what's about to happen in terms of, things that are happening in the world. And our old manager, Gary, was really good at that too. He really had a sense of what that was.
Okay.
What's in the zeitgeist, but what's about to ignite, but hasn't yet.
Sure.
Being able to write to that's been a wonderful thing. So yeah, it's quite a complicated answer to your question, but I think what's the anger is certainly there about a lot of the songs come out of anger and about a sense of injustice about things.
Sure.
Let's see if we can put it to right. It might not happen tomorrow, but it might happen like down the track.
Absolutely. But were your eyes open to that in Midnight Oil, or is that something that you were raised with?
I wasn't particularly raised with it. I had a really sort of weird, well, not weird, but secure, very isolated upbringing. I grew up in Sydney in the northern suburbs. My father was a businessman. We were kind of proudly middle class. We drive Holdens and Fords. We even drive Bentleys and things,
right,
or Rolls Royces. And he was just had his own business. And I went to a pretty good school. I think pretty educated about the world, really. Latin, French, and studied, and then went on to become a physicist at the CSIRO for a while before the band took off.
Was that audio acoustics or
it
architectural acoustics?
Architectural acoustics, yeah. And then the band sort of kidnapped me, basically, which was fine, which is what I wanted anyway. But it wasn't so much in me. It's when I met Pete that I realised that he's someone who's really prepared to stand up for his beliefs, and his parents were, strong Labor Party people, and his mother died tragically, and who I knew, Betty, she's a wonderful woman, beautiful person. I never got to meet his dad. I think he died a few years before. And then, we ended up on this weird journey together of sort of, with our strange music and our proggy kind of tendencies, then playing live, and it got louder and more confident and fast, and people really liked that, and playing in that pub environment was a great crucible for it to be born in, really, and then going on into all the different phases of it. But I think we developed our belief system as a band. I think we all aligned to it at a certain point, and like a pot of dolphins always sort of goes the same way. It was like that with us. There was sort of some sort of symbiotic thing that happened. And then I started writing. I think the first song I ever wrote was really kind of political in that sense, was a song like US Forces was something I came up with in the beginning.
Mm.
And that was very, very strident. And I started reading a lot of books and about getting educated about stuff, about the empire building of the US. And we got hard knocks with it. People wouldn't play the song in America, down the south especially. And you realise after a while, you're going to rub some people's noses up the wrong way. Well, guilty.
But you were used to it by that. Well, perhaps not used to it, but you'd sort of, from the early days of Midnight Oil, you'd very much charted your own course in terms of being independent, in terms of putting on your own gigs and having to go, I guess, to the audience rather than wait for the gatekeepers to bring the audience to you. So you'd always had that determination of what you were going to do, what you wanted to do. So the fact that then some of those political messages wouldn't resonate with an audience or wouldn't even get an opportunity because the gatekeepers would hold them back, I presume that didn't really bother you that much.
Well, we always had our live following, right? We always had the people come to the shows and they kept us going, especially in the beginning. We built an audience the hard way. We realised that the radio wasn't going to play us, Countdown wasn't for us, and the gatekeepers of radio were just like, well, we're not going to play you. But of course, the independent stations did, like Triple J and in Sydney and Triple R in Melbourne. Well, actually, Double J and Double R in Melbourne when it was AM, and a few other exceptions. So we did it a different way to a lot of people. We didn't sort of try and. I think it's always good. Like I just tell this thing a little bit about bands. If they get offered a record deal by a big company, they're so flattered that someone's paying attention to them, they'll sign the first thing that's put under their nose.
Right.
But we weren't like that. For a start, we had a couple of lawyers in the band and a manager like a Rottweiler, and we weren't having any of that. We'd rather not do it, thank you. So we stayed outside of it all. Saw a lot of our contemporaries going in there and being sort of eaten up by it, and realised that it was more important to build up an audience and then they couldn't ignore you then. Hey, there's 1,000 people in a pub. How did that happen? Well, we better pay attention. And then the record labels came and caught them. And then we ended up, I think, with what was called CBS, signing a deal with them in when we were in London making 1098. And actually, no, that was in Place Where the Postcard came out here on CBS in about 1981. So we ended up, doing it a very different way. And we weren't always going to do it our way. It was never going to be, the corporate way or the way that people would sort of normally do it. We just weren't interested in having to bend our nature to them. It just wasn't ever going to work. We were too stubborn and too ordinary. And many times when we made one story is when we made Place Without a Postcard and A&M were going to sign us, and they heard the record and the guy was prevaricating, saying, well, maybe you need to go in and cut a few more singles. And we just sat there and just stared him out, like, that's the record, put it out. We're walking. We're just, and they realised they couldn't work with people like us. We were too bloody difficult, And I mean, I get it about the singles, but, sometimes music isn't, it's all about sort of the path of least resistance. I think sometimes it's better to just have a record that's kind of quirky and has something that touches people, than something that for the masses, I think some of our music later on became more commercial, I suppose, but that was sort of more us. Well, now we can write simpler songs and with straighter rhythms and with good melodic songs. So the air was sort of cleared. Well, but we decided to do that. It wasn't any external pressure.
Yeah.
The record label realised that they couldn't make us do that unless we really wanted to. And when we wanted to, well, of course, they greeted it with open arms.
Were you suspicious when the labels came calling in the early 80s? And then when you found that success a little bit further into the 80s, the worldwide success, were you suspicious or cynical of it?
Yeah, I think it was because we'd done it such a different way. When an A&R guy tells you, you're the greatest rock and roll band in the whole world, and 3 a.m. in some nightclub in, hotel lobby, probably more like it, in New York or something, and you just go, yeah, right, seen it all before. You probably say that to everybody, every artist, to flatter them, get them to do what they want, that they'll sort of lure you into their sort of nest of, and then you're caught in the cobwebs of it. It was one of those that being lured by a spider into a hole. No
right.
Thanks. So we were very suspicious. I think we kind of realised at a certain point when they they saw that we had great potential, I think, as a commercial band. And they saw that the band was striking and could deliver the goods live on any stage, anywhere in the world, at any time. I think that's still like that with us. There's this thing that happens, that's, anyway, I won't even talk about it because it might stop if I talk about it. I don't want to spook it, the magic, because you can't spook the magic. But I think it's sort of, they could see that we had this grand potential and they could see dollar signs. And I think at a certain point, I think when we made Earth and Sun and Moon, I think we realised that they weren't getting it. And they were like, oh, God, those Aboriginal people again, the dust, the red hats, those acoustic guitars, they're going to change it. We don't like what they're doing. And they thought that we were going to be like every other band and I'll get an American producer. I'll move to America and come and work with us and we'll put you in the studio with, whatever. And we just want to do it our way. So we probably shot ourselves in the foot in terms of commercial success in a way, but we didn't shoot ourselves in the foot artistically or in the grand scheme of what a band can be, the arc or the shape of that trajectory of sort of coming up and then going and then tailing off. It's sort of, we were like no other band in that way. We were there for a very long time, but we never I don't think we could even come at that, trying to sort of work with like a hard rock American producer or something like that, which usually would end in tears anyway with any band that went there, any Australian band anyway. They didn't know where we were coming from. They'd be more influenced by Led Zeppelin and, Aerosmith and, Skyhooks or Cultures or that tradition or the Masters Apprentices bands we grew up with.
Yeah.
Well, we grew up with the British bands more, I think. We were more influenced by bands like the Beatles and the Stones and bands like Free and Bad Company and The Clash. When they came along, they were like, yeah, that's pretty, I get that.
Yeah.
It wasn't so much the American hard rock thing. And I think they wanted to put us into that bag. And, that, we were like, well, I don't even understand what that is. So, yeah, we were too quirky, I think. I was suspicious of it, but I think also we didn't have the necessary insouciance or kind of swagger, that was needed to sort of walk into that get on the leather pants and sort of, flames coming out of the end of the guitar sort of stuff. That wasn't, it wasn't that sort of show. We were more how we were born, and what you said before about how you were brought up is so important. It always comes down to that, what you're comfortable with and what you're not comfortable with and what you're going to go for and what you're not going to go for.
Yeah.
And I think because we all had each other as a band, then you can make those sort of decisions by instinct. At that point, we kind of knew, well, maybe this isn't for us. Then we sort of tailed off. We did Breathe and Capricornia and Redneck, Wonderland and albums like that. And we just went off into the sunset like most bands do with the audiences. We just ended up coming back to Australia. The audiences got smaller. We were playing almost in nightclubs. By the time Pete went into politics, things had changed a lot. That was okay. That's just the nature of it. You can't stay out there for very long. You
were content with that trajectory?
Yeah, I think you have to be. And you can't stay up in those lofty heights forever. I mean, it's very rare that you can. So it changes more into a journeyman type of career where you, come what may, you'll just play your music into whoever wants to hear it. Almost the grand story of a troubadour, in a sense, like just turning up at the gig with a guitar in one hand and your merch in the other hand, that sort of thing like a lot of people do now.
Yeah.
It's important that they can continue their voice and people want to come and hear it. Maybe not that many, but it's important that they, who your audience is. So I think that's why coming back in 2017 was such a shot in the arm. It was like people still remember us. That's no small thing.
No. You mentioned that, I guess, the influence of British bands. What was it like for you then when you go over to the UK and you do Place Without a Postcard with Glyn Johns, who, of course, has worked with the Stones and the Small Faces, and presumably you see perhaps evidence of that, be it in plaques on the wall. And from what I understand, I think that may even have been your first time overseas. Was that a daunting experience?
Yeah, it was interesting. I think it was an eye-opener. I'd never been away. Of course, when we got to London, I was just had to go and see the Tower of London and all the things that I read about as a kid, and Buckingham Palace and Oxford Street and the Marquee Club. We actually played at the Marquee Club, actually, the first time we were there. And then meeting Glyn was like meeting this sort of, he was like a giant, really. And he loved the band. He came out to Australia actually looking for bands to produce. And our music publisher put us together with him. And of all the bands he came to see, he really liked us. He really saw something in it, and which was surprising because our music wasn't sort of, but I guess there must have been something in it he could relate to. I think maybe he thought it was more like a punk band, or which were kind of more fashionable in those days, in the early 80s. I think they were, he heard something melodic, he heard something, he thought he could work with us. So we went over to his farm in Sussex and worked with him. And he was a very different sort of person. He knew all the Stones, and I met Ronnie Lane there, my absolute dream, musician. I just couldn't believe I was meeting him. And then Andy Weir-the-Low would come over and play tennis, and then Stu from the Stones was at the barbecue. And then, he just had, all of his mates were these people. And I just, it was sort of like intimidating wasn't the word. It was like almost like shocked by the whole thing. And there was a very steep curve to that. There was no preparation. So I think Glenn, as in terms of his workflow, was not kind of what we expected at the time. I think we expected to make a more layered record or a more professional record than what we had. But he was very much about get it down live. And of course, you listen to the Kinks that he worked, the Kinks and the Stones and the Beatles and Get Back. And then, of course, he did bands like the Eagles as well. And later on, got more mellow. So we thought we'd make a more sort of what people would expect it just to make, like a more professional, but it actually wasn't. It was more raw.
Yeah.
And I love him for that. Like, good on you. Like, but at the time, it was really difficult because he'd yell at you and regale you with all of his stories over a glass of brandy and stop you in the middle of a take and thump the thing and get angry and storm out and, all the things that we never did because we were much more stoic and Aussie males, like, ooh, we're just getting a bit carried away here. But he got performances out of us that I think were extraordinary. And there was one time when Pete was singing a song and he wasn't kind of getting it. Pete wrote the lyrics. He'd go walking through the English countryside with his book and write down words, usually about Australia, because, obviously in England you get homesick, right? So it's a good way to write about Australia when you're in England. A lot of artists have done that, of course. And he came into the studio and it wasn't sounding that great. And Glenn just went out with him for about an hour and a half, just sat with him and spoke very quietly. I didn't know what the hell he said to Pete, anything. But he walked back an hour and a half later. We had been sitting in the control room just ourselves, just what's happening. He came back in and he just looked at us and I got it. Poof, push record, first take.
Wow.
That's record production. That's psychology. That's not like comping a vocal up from a million different takes. It's just one take, and yet the spirit is in the take. He understood that, and that's something that we never met anyone like that who was so down with that idea. And that's Lucky Country. That song Lucky Country, which is just probably the best vocal, one of the best things he's ever sung.
Yeah. Because
he was just put in the state of feeling the words rather than just reciting them. Or there's a real difference between reading something off a piece of paper and feeling it and then singing it. And
sure.
That was like any director in a film does that. It has a rawness to it that's authentic. And that authenticity is what Glenn actually taught us about playing music in the studio. And I think that stayed with us ever since. We always trust that. You can create overdubs and a million sounds and be kind of a sonic architect, like, I think someone said The Edge from U2 was like that. But that's great too. But I think with us, we just all get together and eyeball each other and play the song, and it's quicker too. You just get it down quicker.
Yeah. When you think about that period in the band's career, and you mentioned that was a steep learning curve working with Glenn, and I'm not sure exactly when after that, but at some point you have your first US tour as well, and then you've got the 10-to-1 album. Which of those periods do you think was the steepest learning curve? At what point do you think you really learned this is what it's like to be in a band?
Wow, that's a big question. It's a good question though. What's it like to be in a band? When did you learn? I think often with hardship, you come out of that like a military campaign. And the tours would feel like that. You do this quite disheartening gigs where there wasn't a lot of people there. I think the first time we played the States, there was a few people there actually. It wasn't so bad, but you were there traveling in a bus for weeks and weeks and weeks, and you kind of can't see. There was one time I think we were in Europe in winter, and we were on a bus, and the bus was like this. The driver would only drive 30 miles an hour and stop every 2 hours, and you'd be trying to traverse Europe, and you'd just take forever. And the bus had brown carpet on the walls, and the ceiling was only about 6 feet high, and you're just in this and they're all in it together, and we were all playing chess or whatever we were doing. And that's how you learn to be a band.
Right.
By not necessarily playing music, but about, going through hardship together. And I think at the end of it, you come out stronger. If it doesn't, what is it? If it doesn't kill you, then it must be good for you.
Right.
So we never got killed. We just kept going. And I think there was a sense of there was a real sense of camaraderie and a sense of shared vision, and that you're on a mission. You're on a mission to, not like the Blues Brothers, the mission. We're on a mission from God. It was a bit like that, but it was also this sort of almost, let's bang our head against the wall again until they get it. We'll just keep doing it until they get it. And they did. And we then made records that could actually, Beds of Burning, when that came out, unbeknownst to us, we innocently made a hit record without even knowing that's what we were doing. And when we finished it, I remember saying to Rob, he said, how's the mix? I think we were playing in Blacktown that night or something at the RSL club. And I said, it's good. It sounds anthemic. And I never used that word about anything we'd ever done before, because I don't think it was anthemic, but this somehow was.
Okay.
And that opened the doors. Then suddenly we'd sold 300,000 records in the States, and we were going. And this time it was going to be different from being a sort of a college band or a slightly indie band coming down and playing a club show. This was like we were playing in 4,000 capacity venues. And that song opened that door. But there's no question about what that song did for us in terms of success. But then the song was about land rights. Who would have guessed that? But again, the sound of the song and the melody of the song belies the heavy meaning of the song. It's like you could dance to that song and sing it without even knowing what it was about. And that was sort of the perfect marriage of things for me. That you've got the message, but then the music's like the Trojan horse that sort of makes the message palatable or understandable, and vice versa.
Yeah.
Then that message became sort of palatable too. So it's funny. Yeah, it's a funny marriage of things that in Midnight Oil music.
You mentioned Beds of Burning, and that song and the Diesel and Dust album came out of the Black Fella, White Fella tour, which you did to the Western Desert region of Australia. And I've seen quotes from you where you've said there was life before that tour for you and there was life after. And it was a really defining point in your life. What was the difference between the life before and the life after?
Well, before I suppose you're just making music and you're doing it because you're all together and you've got a shared vision. I think after that, when you achieve success, that's often more difficult in a way to deal with than the road to success. It's sort of like, that you have to keep working really hard to achieve it. But once you achieve it, it can play tricks on the mind. I know that we're all really different about this in the band, and I have a different view of it, perhaps to some, but I found that the success kind of almost, and the pressure, quite stressful. The demand for constant, you have to be everywhere all at the same time, traveling everywhere, all over the world, because it was a world band. It wasn't just in Australia. It was America and Europe and Canada and Spain and Scandinavian countries. And you have to service all of those places if you're touring. Plus, you've got to come up with new music and B-sides, and then you're doing live albums, then you're doing, everything has to be mixed and everything has to be quality controlled. And it gets too much. It's like it became, and at the same time, we all had children. At the same time, more or less the children were born, more or less the same week as Beds of Burning came out. I mean, who would have thought?
Right.
Well, we were all men in our early 30s or whatever, and our partners were too. And so that's what happens with women, they sort of have kids. And I was like, there's a time when they can have it. And they were always looking to that. And I guess we were so caught up with what we're doing. But of course, you have your kids, and it's just the most wonderful thing in the world. But you're really torn because you've got a family life and you've got this huge career, which was, quite a thing. So I found it a bit of a pressure. I was kind of relieved when the pressure came off a bit after Earth and Sun and Moon. And that was sort of an album that took about 5 months to make, and quite a difficult record to make, actually. A lot of pressure for the band to kind of go back to its rough roots, but also the pressure to be commercial and melodic at the same time. And that pressure was coming from us. Again, it wasn't really coming from our record label, although, of course, they would have liked us to come up with something commercial. And again, you've got a team of people that you're keeping alive with your crew and management and your agent and the people who work in the office. It was like a big thing then. It became like a big business. And I found it quite difficult. We all have different jobs within the organisation. As I said, I totally say that the other guys probably thought it was all great and wonderful, and that's fine. I'm glad that they did. But personally, I found it a bit of a load. So when we ended up doing Earth and Sun and finished that, we kind of realised that, we were kind of on some sort of downward thing. And I was sort of all really happy about it, sort of think, oh, well, great. Now we can go back to what we were doing before without the pressure. But, for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. So the pressure to sort of be that and then created this need not to be that. And I think that's what happens with people when they get successful. You either keep milking it or any artist knows that there's your ups and your downs and your peaks and your valleys, as they say. Colin Hay said that, I think, which he'd know more than anybody about what that means. I don't think it's a bad thing. You can't, as I said, you can't stay up at that Mount Everest kind of lofty heights. You can't live very long up there. It just doesn't, you can't. And I felt we were right at that point, one of the biggest bands in the world. And it never worried me that we came down from that. It was just inevitable. Poetic even,
So it wasn't so much the black fella, white fella tour that changed you. It was more that dividing line of big success. Is that what you were saying?
That changed. Actually, that was really important too, because that was in there as well. So we'd hung out with Aboriginal people. We made a record as kind of trying to disentangle what we'd experienced with their culture and finding a country within the country in Australia, and sort of, I guess, because everything we knew was wrong. It was like we thought Aboriginal people were just lived in Redfern and didn't know much about them really at that point. And I never experienced it when I was growing up. We never were taught Aboriginal history at school. All we were learned about were the kings and queens of England. Wow, I still can't quite understand. I know things have changed since then, of course, with the education system, but it was terrible. So when we were thrown into this, we realised that Aboriginal people had incredible problems. There was alcohol, there was abuse, there was the depression of being disenfranchised from your land, but also there was this incredible pride and all these different language groups and amazing music and incredible art. The Papunya Chula movement had just started at that point with the Indigenous artists, and they're becoming world renowned. People like Clifford Possum and Uta Jungler and all of these people were just doing incredible art, and the world was seeing that, but we weren't accepting it here. So we saw that it was like a bit like an acid trip. We came out of there, and the funny thing with that album, which came out of the most profound experience of sort of questioning what it means to be an Australian, really is what it was for me, and I think the others as well, turned into this thing that people around the world completely understood, perhaps more than Australians even did, was especially people in Europe really got the thing between the politics and the music. They never had a problem with having the two together in Europe. Everyone talks about politics all the time there. They're very passionate about it. So the two coincided, the great world fame and this incredible spiritual experience that we'd all had, which again, I think that was another thing which glued the band together and taught us to be a band that we could all learn things together. We could all experience the same thing together and come out of it kind of better as people in a way, sort of version